We are on, Gary.
Yeah,
Hello, everyone.
Yes, we're now ready to go. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining in from different time zones. We are very happy to see you at this SEDCA webinar on clean energy transition in fragile contexts. I'm Seife Ayele, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Brighton, United Kingdom. I'm also a SEDCA IDS support team member and will be chairing this webinar. The Clean Energy for Development, a call for action SEDCA research initiative, generates evidence to inform public policy reforms and innovations in support of transformative clean energy transition, where women and youth can play a key role in greening energy through micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise SMEs. Supported by the Canadian International Development Research Centre, IDRC, the SEDCA initiative brings together 12 projects from across 27 countries aiming to support the knowledge ecosystems that can lead to more inclusive outcomes and efficient investments in sustainable energy transition in low-income countries. IDS has partnered with IDRC to provide the 12 research projects with knowledge translation and communication support, specifically to identify coherent bodies of knowledge aiming to maximize the learning generated by the research and deepen engagement with government, civil society, and scientific community. Progress towards clean energy transition has increasingly been challenging due to several reasons, including policy-induced threats to climate action. Clean energy transition also suffers from resistance and opposition, such as that coming due to burden of cost of transition, a topic that we debated in autumn last year. Conflict, climate-related crises, political instability, economic crisis pose yet another set of challenges to clean energy transition. In this webinar, we will discuss clean energy transition in fragile contexts, focusing on the following questions. One, how can ambitious climate action and inclusive, just energy transition thrive in such environments? Second, what role do states, civil society, small and medium-sized enterprises, and international financial institutions play in ensuring a just and sustainable energy future for the most vulnerable communities? We have three prominent speakers to give short presentations, followed by a question and answer session. And you, the audience, I would like you also to participate, give comments, ask questions, put those questions and comments in the chat or Q&A function. Before taking lots of time, I would like to go to the first. Tabiso, please turn on page 2. Yeah, the first speaker, Amna Mohammed. Amna is a policy economist at the International Growth Center, IGC, where she is working on issues of energy poverty and private investments in fragile and conflict settings. Previously, she was the country economist Pakistan for IGC, working on environmental challenges and climate finance. She has worked on poverty elevation, poverty graduation, and targeting, and has provided research support on capacity development program on public procurement. She had the opportunity to work at the UNHQ during the General Assembly session that saw the launch of Sustainable Development Goals. She holds a Master of Public Administration degree from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Amna, over to you.
Thank you, Seife, and thank you also to IDS for inviting me to speak at this webinar. Today, I will be talking about the broader context of the electricity access challenge in settings affected by fragility and conflict, and situating the crucial role renewable energy can play in these settings to expand access. Next slide, please. The electricity access challenge in fragile and conflict-affected settings is profound. More than 1 billion people reside in countries categorized by the World Bank as fragile and conflict-affected, or FCS, and a majority of these countries are in Africa, and it is estimated that by 2030, they will account for around 2/3 of the world's poor. According to the most recent figures, and this is from 2024, more than 40% of the population in FCS do not have access to electricity. And these statistics are worse for rural areas with almost 2/3 unconnected. Next slide, please. For reference, this is a visual of the countries that have been classified by the World Bank as fragile and conflict affected. The World Bank annually publishes this list, and the countries that are shown are from this year's list. The new list, so they publish a new list annually, and one can imagine that the countries remain almost the same. And this is something that can be expected as fragility and conflict are not short-lived concepts. Next slide, please. Fortunately, the good news is that these settings have massive renewable energy potential. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the solar irradiance globally. And simply, the darker the region, the greater the potential for solar energy. If you superimpose the map for the fragile and conflict-affected states that I just showed on this map, you may be able to visualize the significant overlap between the areas with the greatest solar energy potential and the fragile and conflict-affected settings. The next slide, please. So this second map shows the hydropower potential, and you can see a similar trend here. So these settings also have higher hydropower potential. Next slide, please. So what existing literature tells us is that unfortunately, the governments in these settings, they face multiple challenges. So they have weak administrative capacity, there's inability to enforce the rule of law, the lack of state legitimacy in some parts of the country, elite capture or corruption, and these manifest into fiscal vulnerabilities and low revenue mobilization. So in such settings, there are limited opportunities for policy maneuvering that increases the trade-off policymakers face when trying to deliver on public goods. For instance, public expenditure are frequently diverted from social benefits and infrastructure, including electricity, towards public salaries and security. Another important consideration is the conflict dynamics in some of these settings, where electricity infrastructure is an active target of sabotage. A study estimated that in the decade starting 2010, more than 1,500 targeted attacks were carried out on energy infrastructure by non-state actors, and almost half of them were aimed at transmission networks. And it is particularly in these countries where access to electricity is critical because it serves as an enabler for achieving other development goals. For example, electricity allows children to study longer, businesses to operate at night, healthcare centers to have refrigeration facilities, and saves women from time-consuming daily household work. Expanding the energy access challenge is critical for lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty worldwide. Next slide, please. So understanding the electricity transition challenge in fragile and conflict-affected settings necessitates and understanding, one, the extent of the electricity access gap, and two, the overall renewable share in the current energy mix. So the earlier figures that I shared were an average of the countries affected by fragility and conflict, but we all know that these countries are heterogeneous with unique settings and characteristics. Next slide, please. So the World Bank is one of the data custodians for measuring access to electricity. The International Energy Agency also collects the same data. And the figures shows the data from World Bank. What the World Bank does is it uses nationally represented household survey data, including national census, industry and international sources to track national and global electrification rates using a binary indicator that measures the proportion of the total population that has access to electricity and those that do not at the national and the global level. So now, given how the data is collected, it is important to highlight here that access to electricity does not necessarily mean that the available electricity supply is sufficient, reliable, safe, clean, and accessible and/or affordable. And even those that are connected, they are most likely using a very basic bundle and may not necessarily be graduating upwards on the electricity ladder or towards more productive uses. Also, just the fact that they're connected does not mean that they have electricity 24/7, and at times they remain underserved. In Lebanon, for example, the state, and if you look at the figure, I think it marks as very 100% of the population as connected. But what we know in reality is that the state-run electricity company, the EDL, has been struggling to provide electricity for more than 1 to 3 hours per day since 2021, resulting in a proliferation of privately owned diesel generators providing expensive and dirty electricity to fill the energy access gap. A recent Human Rights Watch report found that this electricity crisis has been exacerbating poverty, hindering access to basic rights such as food, water, and health, and causing air pollution that is adversely affecting the environment. One thing that I would like to point out is that this data is from 2022. So we do know that if you look at Ukraine, for example, or the West Bank and Gaza, these figures are not an accurate representation of what the figures would be if they're collective, the data is collected now. Next slide, please. Another important aspect to look at is the share of renewable and non-renewable technologies in energy generation in these settings. So this figure shows the different components of renewable energy as percentage of total energy generation in these countries. The missing bar is the fossil fuel energy generation. So for example, if you look down at Marshall Islands at the bottom, it generates around 2 to 3% energy through solar. So that means the remaining 98, 97% is through fossil fuel. So when we look at this figure, there can be two conclusions that can be drawn. One, a majority of these countries are predominantly dependent on fossil fuel for energy generation, which makes them vulnerable to fluctuating fossil fuel prices and associated risks. And two, most of the renewable energy generation in the sample countries is through hydropower. So this makes them vulnerable to extreme climate events. We know this when we look at the ND gain index that measures the overall vulnerability of a country's exposure to climate change. We know that the majority of these countries rank highly on the index, indicating that they're more vulnerable to climate change. So in these settings, solar has a lot of potential. We see that it's not as much prominent here as hydropower when we look at the renewable energy proportion. Recent cost reductions and technological advancements in solar, especially solar off-grid solutions, have presented an opportunity to expand energy access in FCS in situations where expansion of the national grid would be prohibitively expensive or susceptible to damage. Importantly, a major advantage of solar installations is that they are modular, so you can match the generation to demand and expand as demand increases. And because they can operate independently from the main grid, they can diversify the risk of central sabotage, as we mentioned earlier, that they are a target of non-state actors. This also reduces reliance on diesel generators that are often expensive, and they're difficult to maintain and suffer from unreliable fuel supply chains in these settings. Next slide, please. So now looking at addressing some of these existing gaps. So I've already discussed earlier the macroeconomic challenges these countries face. There is an important role for international organizations such as DFIs, private financiers, venture capitalists, and philanthropies as well, and climate funds to support the energy transition in these settings through providing financing. Another important thing is to understand the political economy in these settings. Achieving universal energy access will depend on the ability to implement flexible, context-specific solutions that balance these recent technological innovations that we're seeing with the unique political and social realities of each fragile and conflict-affected setting. So this may require different entities collaborating beyond their defined mandate. Given the long-term nature of the challenges in these settings, including the electricity access challenge, the humanitarian development and peace-building efforts should be better aligned to ensure policies and actions are complementary, coherent, and results-oriented, so limited resources are maximized. Another challenge that these countries face is the lack of quality data. For instance, the last census in the Democratic Republic of Congo was held in 1984. Recent innovations in geospatial analysis, supplemented by artificial intelligence and machine learning, have empowered national electrification planning and can help identify to a high degree of accuracy where the unelectrified and underserved communities are. They can also help assess their estimated electricity demand, the renewable potential in that area, and the best technology to apply, so either expansion of the grid, the mini grid, or standalone systems. So these innovations have significantly reduced time and cost typically required for these exercises. The World Bank has been very supportive in different, and they've been helping different countries to develop their national electrification plan using geospatial analysis to find the best electrification mix, and Nigeria is an example. Lastly, developing a renewable energy sector will require labor with the requisite skills and expertise, which is currently lacking in these settings. The first step for governments in these settings looking to scale up renewable energy generation would be to conduct a capacity needs assessment to, one, understand the skills and expertise needed to successfully deliver sustainable and scalable renewable energy projects, and two, to identify existing capacity gaps. The gaps identified during this learning phase, the needs assessment phase, should inform targeted capacity interventions at three levels. So at the policy level, at the project or the program level, and at the consumer or community level. So overall, the renewable energy solutions are particularly promising in these countries that have a large, especially in these countries that have a large proportion of rural or remote communities that can help bridge the rural-urban inequity in electricity access. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I'm just like wrapping up now the presentation, the couple of important considerations just want to close the presentation with. So first, in settings that are affected by fragility and conflict, integrating conflict sensitivity throughout the life cycle of the project will be critical. Conflict sensitivity has multiple interpretations, but broadly, it is an approach undertaken to ensure that any project does not unintentionally contribute to conflict, but rather strengthens opportunities for peace. In other words, for stakeholders involved in renewable energy transition, it is not just about understanding how, or when they're doing their calculations about the financial viability of their projects or the programs, it's not just them trying to understand how the conflict or the fragility will affect their operations, but also how their operations can affect or exacerbate prevailing conflict and fragility conditions. So this understanding has to be a two-way interaction. Another important aspect to point out is that these countries have an important role to play in the renewable energy transition, not just as potential consumers, given their lower electricity rate, but also as suppliers of critical minerals that are necessary inputs in the manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, semiconductors, batteries, etc. So these include the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, which are leading the global mining of critical minerals. It is also important to engage continuously and meaningfully with local community. Renewable energy projects, even if they are, smaller mini grids or solar, at least mini grids, let's say, are actually infrastructure projects with a life of 20 to 25 years or more. So it is important to get local community buy-in earlier on and throughout the course of the project. And lastly, it is critical to share knowledge from developing renewable energy projects in these settings. We won't know what is working or what can work better if you don't know what is not working. So there needs to be more transparency around this. Next slide, please. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Amna, for finishing your presentation in the given 15 minutes, and also for the very useful takeaway messages, which we will come to toward the end of in the plenary session. Next up is Muez Ali. Dr. Muez Ali is the Research and Policy Associate at Earthna Qatar Foundation. He is also an honorary research fellow at the Bartlett School of Environment, Energy, and Resources at UCL. His research activities and interests span food security, climate change in the Middle East and North Africa, Amna region, and Sub-Saharan Africa, electrification and energy access, and the political economy of development. Over to you, Muez.
Thank you, Seife. I don't have any slides, but I thought I will tell you about a recent study that we conducted also as part of an IDRC funded project with the Economic Research Forum Cairo, in collaboration with the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. Specifically, the paper was written with, it was co-authored with Rasha Aqil, who is online actually. And I must admit she did most of the heavy lifting. And I'm sure she'd have some corrections for me and regarding the Lebanon case. But what we decided to do was to compare the transition to renewable energy, or the increased adoption of renewable energy in Sudan and Lebanon. And we decided to do that because we realized that both countries were going through some sort of crisis. And in both cases, there was a palpable uptake of renewable energy. And even though both countries they have significant differences. So Sudan is a very large country. Lebanon is not. They have different geographies. They have different economies. In Sudan, the agricultural sector employs more than 70% of the population. In Lebanon, it's more of a service-based economy. But the crisis, their respective crises have kind of had similar impacts on the energy sector. So in Lebanon, after the 2019 financial crisis, one of the worst in Lebanon's history, GDP kind of decreased by 40% between 2019 and 2020. What happened was that the central bank obviously lost a lot of money, especially foreign currency reserves, and that translated into an energy crisis. So the central bank did not have the foreign currency reserves necessary for Lebanon's utility to import the fuel that it needed to produce electricity. And so the energy sector, as a result of the economic crisis, started kind of, underperforming. And this was, again, kind of worsened by the Beirut blast in 2020. And so as a consequence of that, started generators, which is something that Amna mentioned. So this resurgence of a diesel generator sector happened overnight. People started buying diesel generators and buying diesel fuel to get access to electricity. During this time, the utility, which is called EDL, was only supplying around 8 to 12 hours of electricity a day. And so this continued. The diesel generator sector expanded significantly. And as Amna mentioned, it's quite a dirty sector. But at the same time, the idea of sourcing the fuel, dealing with the black market, and the physical inconvenience of having to go out and the financial inconvenience of having to go out and buying a diesel generator and then buying the fuel made it very difficult. But people still adopted it because they had no other choice. And then in 2021, there was a fuel crisis, and access to diesel fuel was limited. So then people switched to solar. And during the same time, the government devalued the Lebanese pound to align it with the black market, the Lebanese lira, sorry, to align it with the black market rate. So essentially, the inherent subsidy in the fuel, because of the valuation of the Lebanese pound, the Lebanese lira disappeared. So then solar became much more attractive. So people started adopting solar. And then solar started being adopted at homes by small and medium enterprises. people set up off-grid systems in neighborhoods where they would not only consume for themselves, but they will sell to other households. So this huge sector started purely as a consequence of these consecutive crises. So it wasn't a government-planned or a government-driven transition to solar energy. And something similar happened in Sudan. But in Sudan's case, it started a bit earlier in 2011 when South Sudan seceded, and Sudan lost 75% of its oil revenues and then became a net importer of oil. And since that happened, the Sudanese pound started a very quick kind of decrease against the dollar. So it lost around, I think, 75% of its value year on year in the first year, and then it started losing more value as time progressed. And so, but fuel prices didn't change. So this, again, a subsidy kind of creeped in, especially for petrol and diesel at the pump, and then for cooking gas. And the government tried to remove subsidies several times. Once, I think it was June 2012, and then in September 2013, where it increased prices by 50% and then 70% in each case. And so in pounds, the price increased significantly, but because the devaluation the rate of devaluation was faster, the price per gallon for petrol and diesel at the pump was actually decreasing in dollar terms. And so there was this subsidy that was persistent, and the government didn't know how to deal with it. And every time they removed the subsidy, there would be political implications. There would be protests, especially in 2012 and 2013. And so this continued until 2019, where in 2019, subsidies for petrol and diesel accounted for around 30% of the government's budget, which was seen as something as unacceptable by the transitional government that came in after the revolution in 2018. So what that transitional government tried to do was to remove subsidies in order to create some fiscal space for itself. And that was one of the core programs for the government. And so the 2020 budget had no subsidies in it. And obviously there was a lot of political pushback. But then eventually there was some political support, at least from the prime minister, and subsidies were removed in September 2020. And with the removal of subsidies, what happened was that solar power became much more cost competitive overnight. And so there was a sudden surge in demand for solar energy because the electricity sector was unreliable. And just to give you, I don't think Sudan was on the list of countries that Amna put up, but Sudan's electrification rate ranges between 35 to 45%, depending on the source. And for those 35 to 45% who do have access to electricity, they rely on 12 hours, 14 hours a day of electricity on average. And so most people who are able to afford it do have backup generation. A lot of enterprises have backup generation. And so when subsidies were removed from diesel and petrol, a lot of people started using solar. So similar to Lebanon's case. And so there was a massive increase in solar adoption. In Lebanon, I think employment in the solar sector increased by 70% between 2021 to 2022. I suspect something similar happened in Sudan, but there's no data on it. But it was visually detectable. So anyone who lived in Sudan before the war started could see that a lot of houses now have solar panels. A lot of companies are started to use solar panels. A lot of agricultural enterprises started using solar panels. And so in both cases, it wasn't a kind of a government-driven transition to renewable energy. It was more bottom-up. It was people kind of reacting to either inadequacies in the utility or inadequacies from the national grid in terms of providing electricity, and also driven by the need to survive. And this is especially true for small and medium-sized enterprises. And despite the increased cost, so even if you have, if you have a diesel generator using diesel that is unsubsidized versus a national grid that is subsidized, and you are guaranteed 24-hour electricity from the diesel generator or the solar system, whereas the national grid is much cheaper but only guarantees you 12 hours of electricity. The opportunity cost of not having electricity sometimes makes it worth the investment. And investments are quite significant. I think in Lebanon's case, the SMEs that were surveyed said that they used to pay between $350 to $2,000 a month on electricity. And so even in the case where there is cheaper electricity from the grid, the fact that it's unreliable sometimes makes the backup generation of whether it's diesel or it's solar worth it because of the opportunity cost of not having access to electricity. And we saw this in Sudan, not only with electricity, but also for prices of goods and services. So after the removal of subsidies in September 2020, inflation increased significantly. I think it reached almost 1,000% by August 2021. And the reason for that was not just because of the removal of the subsidies, which did cause an increase in prices, but there was a fuel scarcity issue in parallel. So a lot of the transport costs increased because if you are queuing up for 12 hours a day on fuel, that is foregone revenue when you could have been working. So to make up for the lack of work time operating, a lot of the people operating the transport sector increased their prices. And so essentially the increase in adoption of renewables in both cases, and in Lebanon it became even much more institutionalized. There were some municipalities who started adopting renewable energy. They would invest in renewable off-grid renewable energy systems in residential and commercial sectors. So it wasn't just individual enterprises or individual households. And I think what we realized, and we called this a spontaneous transition, because it happened in spite of the state as opposed to because of a state-driven policy agenda. And it didn't need any of the necessary regular, like the usually recommended regulatory interventions, which is having IPP, independent power producer regulations, or having an independent regulatory authority. It was quite ad hoc, it was informal, but it happened. And I think what we concluded was that, despite the known recommendations, the policy interventions that countries in developing countries need to transition to renewables, there is another driver. And I'm not saying crisis is good, but it shows that people will they will do whatever may be necessary in order to get access to the energy that they need to survive or to go about their business. And so I think this is, it's not necessarily an opportunity, because you need to fix the crisis, right? So this is a transition as a result of a crisis. And obviously you need to deal with the crisis in order to not force people to act this way. But then if there is a positive outcome that people start using renewables for whatever purposes, this is an opportunity for governments to build on. And it seems that, at least for Sudan, given the destruction that has happened, especially for the electricity infrastructure that happened during the war, this is an opportunity to kind of build on a system that has been forcibly decentralized. And then, implementing all the regulations that have been put in place in the past, but have not kind of seen the light of day, including regulations for allowing independent power producers, or for public-private partnerships when it comes to energy, setting up an independent regulatory authority, providing financing for renewable energy projects, to build on this new decentralized structure where more and more people are using renewables and relying less on the grid, at least to the point where you can get the grid up and running to serve these areas, and to serve them reliably to the extent that their energy needs, to satisfy their energy needs. I am pro grid electricity, regardless of the source. Obviously, renewables are better, but I am for it because it is much more conducive to long-term development and long-term economic growth than decentralized systems, which in at least in cases like in countries like Sudan, they tend to satisfy very basic needs. And there's there's really very limited room for industrialization or whatever other development policy using only off-grid renewable energy. But it can be a kind of a way to get to the next phase, or which is having a robust kind of universally extended grid that gives access where it's needed. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Muez, for this interesting presentation. Before I invite Neil to give his presentation, may I remind the audience to add your questions or comments in the chat or Q&A box, please, or maybe even keep your questions as the presentations go, your questions and comments, because I would be very happy to take those questions if you raise your hand later on during the plenary session. That said, now I will briefly introduce Neil before he gives his presentation. Dr. Neil McCulloch is a director of the policy practice. His main area of focus is on political economy of reform in the energy sector. This has included work on the challenges of reconstructing the electricity sector in Yemen, corruption in the electricity sector in Lebanon, power sector reform in Kyrgyzstan and Pakistan, energy access in India. Quite a long list, Neil. And previously, Neil was also director of the economic policy program at Oxford Policy Management. And before that, lead economist at the Australian Aid Program in Indonesia. He has also led the globalization research team in the Institute of Development Studies in the UK and was a senior economist for the World Bank in Indonesia. With that introduction, Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Seife. And of course, I'm an associate of IDS as well, which is a great pleasure. So it's great to be back with you. Tabiso, are you able to share the slides? That's great. So I was fascinated to listen to Muez's comments about Sudan and Lebanon. And in fact, a few years ago, I had the great pleasure of working in Lebanon on the challenges of the electricity sector there. And we published a paper on precisely the sort of political economy dynamic that Muez was outlining. And I'd love to read the paper that, that you you produced as well. I think it's a really interesting and important lesson, and it was fascinating to see the comparison. I'm going to draw now on a different example, which is the example of Yemen. And I'm sure you will see several relevant parallels there as well. Next slide, please. So first of all, just to say that this is part of work which the policy practice, which I'm a director of, has been doing together with the International Growth Center for the last 2-3 years. We've been working a lot on the electricity sector in Yemen, and so it was great to hear Amna talking in the broader sense about fragility and renewable energy. We've already produced a couple of reports which you can get from either the policy practice or the IGC websites on improving electricity in Yemen and the various different models that might be applied. Next slide, please. What I want to talk about today is 4 things. First of all, I want to talk about the latest piece of work that we're doing, which looks specifically at the electricity situation in the city of Taiz in Yemen, in Taiz Governorate. I'm only going to be talking about Taiz and also perhaps the more broadly Yemen, meaning the area controlled by the internationally recognized government, not the area controlled by the Houthi coalition, for obvious reasons. But the second reason, the second thing I want to talk about once I've described the situation in the city of Taiz is what you might think of as the obvious or the textbook solution of the problem, and explain a little bit about why it doesn't work. And I think we'll see a lot of parallels here with many of the other contexts where textbook solutions have been applied and have failed. I'm then going to outline a model which might be more appropriate to this particular fragile context. And then finally, I'm going to finish off with a few basic challenges and lessons for other fragile environments. So next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. The electricity situation in the city of Taiz. So as you all know, thank you. So as you all know, Yemen has been in the midst of war for really starting from 2015, so now 10 years coming up of intermittent and sometimes constant conflict. Fortunately, there's been a ceasefire in place for the last little while, but nonetheless, this is a deeply conflict-affected and fragile country. And one of the consequences of that, I think Amna mentioned it, is that war often affects distribution lines, transmission and distribution lines. And there's been extensive damage across the entire country of transmission and distribution lines and the electricity, as well as generation capacity. One of the consequences of this is that Taiz, and the governorate is on the front line, if you like, between the internationally recognized government areas and the Houthi coalition controlled areas. Taiz has had no public electricity now for 9 years. That doesn't mean it hasn't had any electricity. The generation capacity of Taiz was basically damaged, the public electricity capacity, as were the transmission lines leading into the governorate. And as a result, the entire governorate had no public electricity. And so therefore, all electricity in the city of 1 million people or so is provided by private electricity operators. And what Taiz did was it broke up the city into various different squares, as they call them. And then each of these squares is controlled by a monopoly provider. So the monopoly diesel generation for their particular square. Unsurprisingly, this results in extremely high cost electricity because each provider is a monopoly provider and it's a private monopoly provider. And so it's extremely high cost because it's diesel, but it's also very high cost because it's a monopoly and it's very inefficient. Tariffs are very high. That's about 1,000 Yemeni rial per kilowatt hour. That's about $1 or so. Think about typical costs of solar, which might be in a few cents, 5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Poor people of Taiz are having to pay almost $1 per kilowatt hour. And that obviously then makes electricity unaffordable for households and for many businesses. And the inability or the absence of a regulator to be able to control these tariffs makes it very difficult for the local population to do anything about it. The one bright side, if you can consider it that, is that billing and collection is done very effectively. Each of the private operators who run their particular squares are private entities. It's their money. They bill and they keep the money. So as a result, billing and collection is done extremely efficiently because people want to actually make money from this. So there is actually no problem with collection. There is, or lack of payment, because you simply get cut off if you don't pay. But of course, the amounts you have to pay are extortionate. Next slide, please. So that's the situation in Taiz. And as you can imagine, that has led to a huge amount of local discontent. This is a picture from one of the many protests that have happened in Taiz as a result of the poor quality and the very high cost of electricity provision. And you can see this kind of protest all across Yemen as a result of blackouts that are happening, for example, in Aden or in other cities around the country due to the poor quality of electricity. So this is a major crisis for the country and a major crisis also of political legitimacy, which makes it particularly important to deal with. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you an indication of how the system operates. This is a map of the governorate of Taiz, and right in the middle there, where all the lines are converging, you can see Taiz city itself, which is what I was talking about. different bits of the governorate are controlled by different factions within of the overall coalition that represents the internationally recognized government. I should point out that this is an old map and these things are constantly shifting, so please don't hold me to the particular boundaries that are written here. But you may want to pay attention to the individual power stations. Each of these little lines that you can see in the boxes there, you may not be able to read it, are individual generators. And this is the way in which electricity is provided in the governorate. In one company has 2 generators here, one company has 3 generators there, one has 150 kilowatts here and another 80 kilowatts there. That is the nature of decentralized diesel-based provision in a situation where you have no public electricity provision. Next slide. So what's the obvious solution? Well, if I was a world banker, and I was, then I would say, well, what we really need to do is to give some resources to the public electricity company to rehabilitate the network because it's been badly damaged. We did a calculation of the total amount needed in Thai City, and it's remarkably small. About $11 million is what's needed to get the system up and running again in pure equipment costs. Then what you do is you procure and build a large, new, much more efficient power plant. It could be renewables, it could be heavy fuel oil, something far, far better than diesel, basically. You install some prepaid meters, you collect all the bills efficiently, you set tariffs to cover the costs, so they're cost reflective, and you regulate the operators. And bingo, problem solved. Unfortunately, pretty much all of these obvious recommendations, standard best practice regulations, are not possible in the context of Yemen. The central government has no resources to give Thais for rehabilitation because of its huge fiscal crisis. It has lost a lot of its oil and gas revenue because of Houthi attacks on oil exports, which means that nobody will insure ships coming in and out. The government therefore depends entirely, almost entirely, on friendly nations and development partners for investments. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia promised a power plant, but of course that depends upon the money actually arriving and the power plant being built. Development partners are typically saying, well, we might be able to lend, but we'd only be able to lend if there's a systematic reform program in place, and there's discussions about that. Existing operators don't want to relinquish the power that they have to provide electricity because they're making lots of money from the process and they are well connected. The population don't want to pay extremely high tariffs and they want to maintain subsidized tariffs, at least in the areas where public electricity still exists. And of course, these existing operators have influence. They're there for a reason. They're allied with particular groupings, which make it difficult to dislodge them. So you can't just wave a regulatory decree and tell them to go away. That simply won't work. So the best practice is simply not possible. So what might be? Next slide, please. So here is a model that might work, and one which we've discussed extensively with our Yemeni counterparts and Yemeni experts. And what it would consist of is follows. Again, it does rely upon finding external funding for the building of a sensible sized power plant that might serve the city. And so again, the question is, where's the money come from that? And it might come from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, development partner or whatever. But if that was built and if the network was rehabilitated, then it would be possible to sell electricity wholesale. You don't need to displace existing, powerful, well-connected private operators. You can sell them cheaper electricity. And if you do sell them cheaper electricity, you could do so on condition that they wouldn't have to run all of their expensive diesel generators. You could do so on condition that tariffs are brought down. So thus there is a kind of model whereby an external intervention could reduce the cost of electricity to the benefit of consumers while crowding in, creating an incentive for existing private operators to come within of the regulatory ambit of the national regulator and say, okay, we will be bound by certain tariffs, and in return, you're going to give us cheaper electricity. There's a bargain to be done there. So that's the model that might work. Next slide, please. The idea is if a friendly government will fund a generation plant, then PEC, the Public Electricity Corporation, can run it. The private sector could be asked to bid for a concession if there's no public money for that. Either of those could work. And then on the distribution side of things, existing operators can basically continue to do the job they have, but instead of running expensive diesel old generators with lots of pollution, they can be purchasing at much more efficiently produced electricity. Next slide, please. The real challenge is this also hasn't happened. So the question then is why, and I'm happy to raise some of those issues in the discussion. So here is a model that is consistent with the underlying political economy, and yet it's also stuck for a bunch of reasons that I probably haven't got time to go into. Next slide, please. So let me talk more generally about some of the reasons why fragile contexts make it extremely difficult to make progress on any electricity provision, renewable or otherwise. And I'd like to point to 6 things. Firstly, and number 1, security. If you happen to be on the front line of a conflict, as Thai City is, then there is a very significant possibility of the re-emergence of conflict. And if you get the re-emergence of conflict, then very few people are going to want to invest in any major capital infrastructure. One of the reasons why, as Muez and Amna were pointing out, you get an awful lot of investment in small-scale solar is that it's much more resilient to conflict situations because it's tiny. But if you're building a major power station and you're nearby an area of conflict, then this is the kind of thing that can get damaged as a result of a resumption of conflict. Knowing this, few investors will want to actually put the money in. Secondly, even if you did have people wanting to put the money in, very few people want to supply guarantees for this sort of thing. Governments in fragile and conflict-affected states often have a very weak fiscal position. And if that's the case, then even if they offer you a sovereign guarantee, which is what most lenders would require, the sovereign guarantee may not be worth it. If somebody is lending you money and they know that that guarantee is going to get called on, they're not going to give you a guarantee. So financing is a key challenge. The policy and legal framework is often a real challenge as well, because the legal and policy framework is often years out of date. Most of the laws in Yemen regarding the electricity sector were pre-war. Now, some of them are appropriate, but some of them are completely out of date. But governments haven't got an easy process whereby they can just update those and therefore bring into place a new legal situation because they're busy trying to deal with the current situation. So how do you make progress outside of the law without breaking the law? Then, of course, there's the issue of political control. Governments are not always in full control of their territory in fragile contexts. Power tends to be fragmented. Different factions control different areas. This is generally true, not just in Yemen. And that naturally makes enforcement of any kind of deal rather difficult. Then there's an issue of regulatory capacity. We say, oh, the regulator should do this and the regulator should do that. Regulators are typically full of well-skilled, well-educated staff who very often have fled a conflict environment or are not around anymore, or who have had to devote their attentions to trying to keep their families safe or moving to different areas. So their regulatory capacity is often very weak. And then finally, in environments, as Muez was describing earlier, where you still have very heavily subsidized fuel or very heavily subsidized electricity, often that's not fiscally sustainable. But nonetheless, it continues because rapid increases in tariffs are just political suicide. And so governments get torn, but in a situation where they're politically not able to implement cost-reflective tariffs, but without implementing cost-reflective tariffs, they have no fiscal space to maneuver. These are the challenges. So my last slide, next slide, please, is lessons learned from trying to do electricity reform in these type of contexts. Number 1, tailor the reforms to the context. Best practice is not a good guide. In fact, best practice is sometimes the worst thing to do. Make sure you really understand the context, which goes to the second point. Understand who has power, over whom, and over what. Do your political economy analysis. You really have to make sure you understand the context. The third one is perhaps one of the hardest ones. Accept that some desirable things are impossible, at least for now. There are many things which are desirable, but some of them just can't happen in the political economy context that you're operating in which case you just can't do them, and trying to do them will simply fail. Instead, give autonomy to people who really understand the context. That's usually locals who are living in it, and give them the authority to experiment with unorthodox approaches. That authority to experiment is key. Quite often, external actors tend to want to keep control, and as a result, they don't aren't able to implement things which are really grounded in local knowledge. Try multiple approaches to see what works before scaling. Too often we have donors coming in with grand plans for the whole sector. Don't do that. We don't know what works. That's the truth. So try multiple things and focus on approaches that have the prospect of long-term sustainability. Very often there are certain types of approaches, particularly generation plants, which aren't really designed for long-term sustainability. And then the final one, which is perhaps the least, the one that donors in particular least like hearing, which is take your time. The number of times one is pushed to produce something because the end of a donor financial year is coming up. This is nonsense. Fragile and conflict environments will take ages and ages to resolve. It's going to take years, so therefore take one's time over reforms. So those are the lessons that at least I've learned from my experience of working in these contexts, and I'd love to chat further about it. Thanks, Seife. Sorry for taking too long.
No, you didn't. You finished on time. Thank you very much, Neil, and for highlighting the challenge of fragile context, but also for the very, very useful takeaway messages. I'm sure the audience will agree with you. Now, I'm happy to take questions from the audience. I've already got a couple of questions, but please keep the questions coming. I will maybe pose those questions first to you, the speakers. They came from Charles Laurie, and thank you, Charles, for those two very interesting questions. Question number one is directly states as follows: what do the panelists make of the argument that decentralized solar expansion involves fossil fuel expansion because of its implicit reliance on diesel generators? Maybe we just reply on this question first. Can I give this question to Muez first to respond to this question? I'll repeat the question to you, Muez. What do you make of the argument that decentralized solar expansion involves fossil fuel expansion because of its implicit reliance on diesel generation? Muez.
I think it's a fair argument. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, someone recently gave me a statistic for grid level for grid scale solar in the UK, and apparently for every gigawatt for every megawatt of solar, you need, I think, half a megawatt of natural gas or something, because of the intermittency issue. So it's, I mean, I don't think it's a problem as long as it's, I mean, ideally you want renewables as much as possible, but in a lot of cases it depends on what the purpose is of the electricity itself, which is, I mean, the point that I tried to make towards the end of my brief intervention was that, I mean, it depends what you want the energy for, right? Do you just want to achieve electricity access because that's what SDG 7 says? Is universal access to electricity, satisfied through small 20 watt solar home systems that can only satisfy basic electricity needs enough? And so, when you start asking about what the energy is for, then you have to start thinking about what the governments of these countries want to achieve in the long term. And so, so if the long-term goals they're more aligned with renewable energy expansion that requires diesel generators or natural gas capacity or whatever it may be, then I don't see that. I think that would be a valid argument. I mean, I don't see any problem with increasing use of diesel generators to support renewable energy expansion, as long as it satisfies a certain goal of what the energy is being used for.
Any addition Muez or opposite view, Neil, Amna?
Thank you, Seife. So I'll just come in to and add to what Muez said. So yeah, so we generally, when we talk about solar generation, we talk about either we talk about solar mini grids or solar, yeah, well, at least let's focus on solar mini grids for now. So there is a component of diesel generation there, and that's because, again, as Muez said, there's that the element of intermittency. So the sun is not out all the time, not out on cloudy days or at night. So in order to maintain the financial viability of their project, the developers they incorporate a diesel element to it. Recently, what we have been seeing is there's been technological innovations in solar equipment. So you have smart meters, smart sensors, and other kind of equipment that has been developed to support this intermittency and try to control it at some level. The other thing is to look into if you're thinking about majority solar generation, even if you have these smaller off-grid setups, is doing some kind of community capacity building. So maybe engaging with the community, informing them what would be the best time to use the electricity. So when you talk about productive uses of electricity, the idea is that the productive use is taking place during daytime, where it's easy to generate the electricity. I think I know Muez mentioned this on the extension of the national grid and looking at off-grid solutions. There was some very interesting, I think it was in a World Bank report that I just want to mention here. So the report talked about the first generation of mini grids, and it said that the first generation, they emerged more than a century ago in highly populated urban areas or where there were lower costs associated with supplying electricity. And these mini grids were critical to the industrialization of rising economies, which included China, United Kingdom, and the US. So over time, what happened was through increasing demand and better technologies, there was bigger generation and construction of the distribution systems that took place. And all of these then, well, not all, but partly they connected to form the main grid. So that's where they think, the mini grids did actually started off as smaller, just targeted areas around urban settings, which had the demand. And then later, well, some of them were stranded and some of them were integrated into the main grid. And maybe that's one way of thinking about the fragile and conflict-affected settings, where some regions may be highly volatile and some regions may not be that volatile. So thinking more creatively about, how can, if you have to have a longer term strategy, again, this is going to depend on the governments who are leading the electrification planning, in thinking about how do they expand this access to areas that are unconnected. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amna. I will give the second question to you, Neil, because you have been looking at restructuring of the industry in your past research. So the second question from Charles goes as follows. His second comment is about the failure of the World Bank's unbundling agenda, which has completely failed to deliver the privatized grids that it was supposed to across the world. If foreign capital just isn't flowing into low-income countries because of the unattractive risk-reward ratio, how do states achieve transition? Neil.
So I've tried to provide a partial answer to that in the Q&A.
Yeah.
But there's two separate issues there. First of all, if anybody hasn't already read the wonderful 2019 report that Vivian Foster and her team led in the World Bank, please do. I think it's going to be one of the seminal reports on energy and electricity sector reform, because it effectively amounts to an admission by the World Bank that the last 10 to 20 years approach of power sector reform hasn't worked, and that the main reason why it hasn't worked, or hasn't worked as effectively as they would have liked, and the main reason it hasn't is because they've taken a cookie cutter approach in a situation where they needed to tailor to context. And I think this is something that the bank is really taking on board now far more, is that countries are different, contexts are different, the politics is different. You have to tailor reforms to the different contexts, and that report maps that out very nicely. But let me just pick up on the second point of Charles's very useful question, which is, if foreign capital isn't flowing into low-income countries, how do states achieve transitions? I think that's the wrong question. And I think one of the things which I personally find frustrating is there's an awful lot of time and effort being spent on saying, how do we achieve an energy transition in poor, conflict-affected and fragile states? I don't think this is the priority, and I don't think it should be the priority. The priority should be dealing with the conflict and the fragility, providing livelihoods, providing peace, trying to move things forward. Ultimately, the thing which will provide an effective energy transition in any context is if you have a stable and functioning economy and a stable and functioning polity. And we need that in order to be able to do the energy transition. Now, that doesn't mean that one shouldn't do renewables. Renewables can have great benefits in all sorts of contexts, and often they're much cheaper and more resilient technology. But I think if we start with the energy transition, we're starting in the wrong place. Personally, working on Yemen, I find it terribly frustrating when people say, well, Yemen needs to push forward in the energy transition. And I'm thinking, you know, what was Yemen's contribution to overall CO2 emissions over the last 1,000 years? Virtually nothing. What was that of the United States or Europe? I think quite a bit more. So let's not focus on an energy transition for Yemen. Let's focus on trying to get electricity to actually function and to reach ordinary people. And that then boosts the economy, it supports peace. And then that then facilitates the energy transition in and of itself. So I think we've got it slightly the wrong way around there, in my view.
Thank you very much, Neil. I know it's not my role to answer questions, but my own research in this area suggests that part of the problem is some of the developing countries give priority to multinational companies, incentivize multinational companies to come in and generate energy. And of course, for various reasons, for the same topic that we are discussing now, fragility issues, security, economic crisis, inability to pay in forex, all of these have been severely affecting the international agencies to deliver on what was expected. And plans have been unfulfilled in many ways, delays, not delivered on time, on planned cost, all of that. So part of the suggestions that came out of the research that I was involved was to perhaps to encourage the domestic industry, green industrial policy, as we said, could be one way of incentivizing the domestic economy rather than just relying on international capital. And that said, I will move on to another question by Kazi Edge. The question runs as follows. Renewable energy systems on the scale often necessitate reliance on Chinese manufactured clean energy technologies, raising critical concerns regarding sourcing and geopolitical dependencies. Is there an example of indigenous innovation and localized production strategies to facilitate just transition or energy sovereignty? Maybe I give this question to Muez again.
I mean, I don't know of any examples,
Okay.
just off the top of my head. But I also don't see a problem with, at least in the short term. Obviously, for energy sovereignty's sake, you know, no country wants to be reliant on any other country for one to be relied on one country for anything. I don't see I don't think it's a problem that, you know, this sector is dominated by Chinese manufactured goods. But I mean, in the long term, you know, just the reliance on any one country is a problem. And it's not just reliance on China or the US or any other country. And you know, now a lot of African countries are talking about energy sovereignty as opposed to energy security. And a lot of African academics think that African countries can achieve that within the continent, not individually. But yeah, so I think if talking about energy sovereignty, this is potentially it is potentially a problem, but not because it's reliance on specifically Chinese manufactured goods.
Mm-hmm. Amna or Neil, would you like to come in on this?
I think I'll just add, I think there is globally a lot of reliance on Chinese manufactured renewable energy equipment, and that Chinese, it's across the value chain. So if you start from the critical minerals, so the processing that takes place in China, I think it's far ahead in the game than what the rest of the world is. So they have been doing the R&D, and they've built their expertise in the renewable energy throughout the supply chain. So as Muez said, maybe they saw an opportunity and they became ahead of everyone. But there can be an opportunity for regional cooperation, at least, and this is what we've been hearing within Africa, when they're talking about how does the continent maybe come together for energy sovereignty. So yeah, I mean, the reliance is going to be there at least for the couple of years.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the challenges is that setting up and managing the development of a supply chain and all of the associated things that are needed to have a credible industry requires peace and stability and a degree of fiscal balance. And those are precisely the things which are often lacking in fragile and conflict-affected places. So in the interim, it's very difficult to do anything other than rely on imports. However, that said, one of the things which we noticed, and it's certainly true in the Yemeni context, when the crisis first emerged in Yemen, there was a huge boom in solar. And then that boom sort of actually tapered out around about 2018, 2019. And one of the reasons it's tapered out was because of the dreadful quality of some of the stuff which was coming in, and people became very disillusioned. So one of the regulatory focuses shouldn't just be upon trying to build up your domestic supply chain, which frankly takes years, but it should be in trying to ensure quality of the things which are coming in. Because if everybody says, oh yeah, we tried that solar thing and the battery broke after a year and it was rubbish, then you've blown the reputation of the entire technology for some time. So quality matters as much as setting up your own supply chain, at least in these sort of contexts in the short term.
Thank you very much, Neil. The next question, there is a question specifically aimed at you, Neil, but I will probably suggest either Muez or Amna to answer this question, which came from Tarila Ebede. Are mini grids a sustainable solution to challenges of energy transition in fragile and conflict-affected contexts? Either of you can take this question. Feel free to come in, please.
Anyone go first?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So, Muez,
No, there is a question aimed at you. So maybe Muez.
Muez, over to you first. You go.
Yeah, Muez.
Sorry, did you? Okay.
I meant Muez, not Neil. Sorry.
Okay. I mean, no. I mean, I don't see mini grids as a sustainable solution to anything. I mean, yes. I mean, Neil's written answer is spot on. They're good for addressing, basic needs. But in a fragile context, if they can't address the underlying the core issues of the conflict, then it's not very useful. And they're not useful in the sense that they provide a certain level of energy. You can't go beyond that. So if you're using your mini grid to power a TV and some lighting and the phone charger, and then you decide you want to buy a fridge, you can no longer use your mini grid, right? You would have to, you're either going to take energy away from somebody else, or you would have to upgrade the system by yourself, which is so. And so they have their solutions like they have their advantages. So one thing about solar is that it's modular. You can increase the system, you can decrease it. They're not large scale infrastructure. They don't necessarily get destroyed, or they might not necessarily get destroyed if there's conflict. You can set them up anywhere. So these advantages, yes, but are they a solution to challenges of the energy transition in the fragile? They probably are not. And I think, as Neil said earlier, an energy transition in a fragile and conflict-affected context is a weird concept, to be honest, because it's not a priority. But yeah, mini grids do have advantages, but I don't think we should kind of overblow what they can actually achieve.
Amna, any quick addition to that? You don't have to necessarily agree to what Muez is saying, obviously.
Yeah, I think what I'll say is I think so when the government is doing the national electrification planning, there needs to be an integrated approach. So the government needs to decide which areas are best served through the national grid, which are best served through solar grids, and which are best served through solar home systems. Because within any region, in any country, in different regions, you will have remote communities, you will have very rural communities, and thinking about expanding the national grid to them, can be prohibitively expensive, and it can take ages. So not just to meet the SDG 7 target, but also just to improve the quality of life of the citizens. And electricity is a basic necessity. So if you want to think about the trade-off, so there is a trade-off. The national grids, the tariffs are much cheaper than cost-reflective tariffs that private solar mini grid developers, let's say, charge. But there's a trade-off also in terms of the time that will take to electrify all these communities, and then the cost, and then the quality of electricity as well. So obviously the national grid would allow you to do a bit more with more opportunity for business. But yeah, there's definitely a trade-off here. And whenever the electrification planning is done, these are all considerations that need to be taken place. But there needs to be some integrated approach where all three can work in different settings.
Thank you very much, Amna. Neil, you are most welcome to share your view on this, but I have a question specifically addressed to you. The question is from Peter No. Peter, I'm very pleased to have you in this call. Here is a question, Neil. I have some sympathy with your this is Peter's question. I have some sympathy with your response. Is there a danger with transition letter approach that long-term carbon intensive infrastructure and grid get built to meet short-term needs that will be costly to build, maintain, and if they are to generate electricity for export, they may end up being stranded as demand shifts, excuse me.
Yes, so part of me saying what I said on energy transition was to rise Peter, and I succeeded. And you'll see my response in the answer there. I think this isn't an issue of transition later. It's about starting with the core problem. The core problem in fragile and conflict affected areas is that they're fragile and conflict affected. This is the thing which is damaging development. This is the thing which is ruining people's lives. And so it's important that the focus should be on that. Now, that doesn't mean that renewables shouldn't play a part of it. I certainly am not of the view that you should just then plow on with fossil fuel infrastructure developments in any context, even when renewables make more sense. But I think it has to be a balance. I think it has to be what's feasible in that context in order to try and rehabilitate people's lives and to try and promote peace. And that will eventually lead to a situation where one can have a much more systematic strategy, such as that Amna just was outlining a second ago, about how you achieve this transition. But you're not going to get to that point unless you start actually being able to supply electricity. I'm not worried at all about stranded assets as demand shifts for stuff which is for export. Let's just try and get a sense of context here. Do you know how little electricity Yemen is generating, how little electricity Lebanon is generating, how little Sudan is generating, how little Nigeria is generating? We're so far from meeting the domestic needs. There's no possibility of this stuff being done for export. This is just about trying to improve upon meeting existing needs. And as a consequence, I think there is a role. So I'll give you an example, a very concrete example. One of the debates in the Yemen context is what to do about getting rid of diesel. Diesel is just about the most dirty way you can generate electricity. It's extremely air polluting and extremely expensive. And of course, it's a fossil fuel. If you were to shift to heavy fuel oil, which is also a dirty and unpleasant fossil fuel, you cut the costs by half or more. So you can dramatically improve the efficiency with which you're generating electricity, but you're still using a fossil fuel, and perhaps you're burning it slightly more efficiently, but it's still polluting. Should you do that if that's possible, or should you insist that we're going to move to wind or solar, which might take a very long time? The reality is you can do a bit of both. Some things you can move to HFO, or you could move to HFO, but then you could hybridize it with solar so that you're benefiting from the high solar irradiation, but then you're also being able to supply electricity overnight when you may well need it, even if the sun isn't there to shine. So there's ways of hybridizing these things that get the benefit of both. But I think if we take a sort of almost a theological approach saying only renewables, then you're effectively condemning fragile and conflict-affected situations to having no electricity rather than having some sensible hybrid. I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, maybe I throw this question at Amna, because you have been talking about sensitivity, conflict sensitivity in project design, Amna. How can local communities be involved in the design and implementation of practical solutions, simple solutions, solar panels, and contribute to, say, peace building or mitigate conflicts?
Yeah, thank you, Seife. So I'll give the example of a private electricity company that we did a case study on. So Nuru is it's an electricity company. It has around 4 operational sites and at least 3 that are under development in east and northeast of the DRC. So as you know, that is a highly sensitive area. And these sites, they provide services to communities that have experienced war, armed group violence, and fragility. And generally, if you understand the context of DRC, there are more than 100 armed groups, and there are millions of people who are living there as refugees or are internally displaced. So given the highly sensitive context, the one question that we posed to Nuru when we were having these discussions was, how do you engage with the local community as you're thinking through your site and you're thinking through your project life cycle? What they did say was, that buy-in from the community is very important for them. So if they don't have that buy-in, you will have issues such as power theft, infrastructure damage, and user complaints, and so on. So what they do is they understand, and again, this is understanding the local context. So they understand that in the DRC, there's a relationship-based culture. So what they do is they maintain a close contact both with formal community leaders and also the informal community leaders. And what they did also was they have an in-house community team that comprises of members of the community. So they also recruit locally, and when they do this recruitment of site managers and technicians, they pay close attention to the community demographics. And they give the example of their site in Bunia, where they wanted to ensure that their hiring patterns did not exacerbate existing grievances, because there are 2 dominant communities there, the Hima and the Lendu communities, that don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. So they made sure that when they were hiring, that they were mindful of these kind of dynamics. And then also just, I think, being smart and being understanding the community in a way. For example, they mentioned that during elections can become very sensitive. So that's when they also engage very closely with the community to keep abreast of situations so that things don't deteriorate or don't affect the prevailing local peace, and also training their staff for mitigation actions. So this is one way. I gave you like a real world example just to situate it so people can start thinking about how communities can actively be involved and how companies are actually deliberately thinking about how to engage communities within their project lifecycle. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Any additions from your side, Muez, on this, or maybe move on to another question?
I think generally community engagement, localization, they've become buzzwords in development discourse generally. Conflicts tend to be an outcome of the lack of community engagement, and multiple other things, right? Centralization of decision-making, lack of investment, marginalization, poverty, etc. But it's one of the reasons why there are conflicts in these regions to begin with. Community engagement is good for the success of any project, not just energy projects. And in some cases, companies, if it's not government, the companies are incentivized to engage the community because it hurts their bottom line, right? So for example, the example that Amna gave, increases in theft. So if you don't engage the community, they will steal from you. So that is a profit consideration, right? And so, whether it's the government engaging the community or private companies engaging community, I think the intention would be different. But again, I don't think community engagement is the kind of the major issue. It's almost become a necessity. So if you don't do that, then none of the interventions may succeed. And at the same time, I think this brings me back to my earlier point that all of these, you have to start with the reason behind the conflict, the reason behind the provision of energy, the supply of energy. Are you doing it for conflict prevention? Do the people making the intervention see energy as one of the services that people lack, and hence they are taking up arms against central government or against each other because they lack electricity? And so electricity has a role to play, or energy has a role to play, but it's not more important than anything else, right? All of the services are important. Infrastructure is important. Governance is important. And I know this webinar is about energy, but I feel like, there is a broader conversation when it comes to conflict, right? Which is the point that Neil has been making since the beginning of this webinar, is that look at what the underlying issues are, right? Once you understand what the underlying issues are, then you might even find that energy is energy in these contexts is an easy problem to solve once you solve the underlying problems. And there are other implications that are sometimes not seen. And I'll give you an example from Sudan. When the subsidies were lifted in September 2020, there was a study done by the UNDP and wasn't published for political reasons, basically. Even though subsidy removal was an economically robust decision, right, supported by the central government, supported by IMF, World Bank, etc., and supported by the private sector, there were border towns in West Darfur, bordering with Chad, where there was
10 seconds.
Sure. Where there was a significant uptick in rape cases, right? Because when there were subsidies, a lot of people in these border towns would smuggle fuel across to Chad because they would sell it for a higher price. And then these excess revenues they would use to provide electricity and lighting in these border towns. When they removed the subsidy, which was a sound economic decision, right, and it made sense for everybody, and you would help conflict prevention and increase electricity access, etc., it has these super negative impacts on specific people.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I was meant to give like a quick summary of what is going on, but it's almost half one now. Clearly, the webinar has brought out some of the fragility, security-related challenges, particularly in low-income countries. I very much appreciate the takeaway points that all three speakers brought out, giving autonomy to people to understand context, integrating conflict sensitivity in project life cycle, engaging continuously and meaningfully with local community. All of those are very useful points, and I thank you very much, the speakers. I also thank IDRC and IDS colleagues for making this event to happen. Finally, I thank the audience for listening and participating in this webinar. IDS CERCA organized a series of similar events, and we hope to see you all again. Thank you very much, and bye for now. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.